Well, there was 2 CPR officials, supposedly, standing on the banks of the South Saskatchewan, looking out over the water.
Well, there were some surveyors that were looking for a place to build a railroad across the river.
And one of them said to the other one, this is such a nice outlook.
Outlook. It was a beautiful outlook.
It was because of these 2 CPR land buyers that were out buying land for the CPR. And the CPR was obviously the railway, and that's how the town of Outlook came to be. They established Outlook alongside the banks of the river. The town of Outlook was, to my understanding, one of the fastest growing small towns back in 1908. There was an article written about Outlook in a paper in London, England, because word had spread across that it was a fast-growing little communities. In August of 1908, and they had a land sale, and that's how they established towns. The CPR railway owned a bunch of land. They had an auction, and they sold off parcels of land, and they had already established the village.
On August 26, 1908, a land auction was held in the middle of a field. A large crowd of buyers was in attendance. Excitement was in the air. The auctioneer, Mr. Norris, stood on a buggy to begin the sale. The Hull Company bought the first 2 lots for $1,825. This is where the Outlook Printers now sits. By noon on the day of the auction, some of the early buyers had already marked their lots. Lumber that had been bought in Hanley and Moose Jaw was hauled into town so that building could begin. By the afternoon, the sounds of sawing and hammering could be heard throughout Outlook. Over 500 town lots were sold. Charlie Brown had the honor of pounding in the first nail in the new town. A letter was sent to the provincial government in October 1908 to set up the new village.
So I would guess there would be a few hundred people there originally, but that might even be before people knew it was a town per se. People would come there to work, and for various reasons, agriculture had already established itself, and then it just goes from there. So it was a progress from there on. By the time 1909, I think, the town was in around 600 to 700 people already.
Outlook officially became a village on December 19, 1908, less than 4 months after the auction. A group of men formed the Outlook's first village council. The council immediately asked the Saskatchewan government to build a ferry across the river. 4 months later, their wish came true. On May 9, 1909, the ferry had its first trip across the river.
Nobody really enjoyed riding on the ferry. The sandbars got in the way sometimes.
But I know one thing, they had a big fair in 1909, and they drew 1,000 people to a fair, a community fair. And people came from Moose Jaw on the train to take part in one-day fair that they had in Outlook. So.
The community's first celebration was held on July 1st, 1909. A special train was hired to bring visitors from all over the area. The Outlook Motor Hotel served 642 meals that afternoon.
Coming to Outlook on 1st of July was a very important day for us.
For the ladies' things, there was sewing and cooking, and I loved the flowers and all the garden
They might
produce.
not have had vegetables on July 1st, but they had flowers. And there were groups in almost all the towns called horticultural societies, and that means you got to show off your fruits and vegetables and win prizes.
The prizes weren't very big, just maybe $1 or $2. I remember my mother used to grow, a good garden, and she tried to find 12 pods of peas that were all the same and very big. And then they'd have horse races, and you'd take your cattle and, have them judged, the best ones. You'd even have chickens there. People competing to who had the best chickens, and ducks and geese. They'd play ball too. and have all kinds of games and rides for kids.
On November 23, 1908, the first train came to Outlook. It took men all day and night to unload lumber, coal, machinery, hardware, and groceries. In 1912, the train bridge, now called the SkyTrail Bridge, was finished. This allowed both passenger and commercial traffic to cross the South Saskatchewan River for the first time without using the ferry.
Began, I think, in the summer of 1910 and finished in 1912, and the first train went across it in 1912.
We used to love to come to Outlook. It was a big deal to shop and to go to the cafe for a meal. So it was really interesting to walk around to see all the different things.
It would have been quite a project back then because there wasn't quite the equipment available then that there is today to build those kind of structures.
Standing 150 feet above the water, this bridge is also one of the highest bridges on the Canadian prairies.
Oh yeah, that's a lot of grain would come through that. There used to be tonnage coming through the bridge, and they'd have to slow down at that bridge. They couldn't pound the wheels, you know, they had to be careful, just glide through there.
But the men that looked after the tracks checked them, you know.
And I was a brakeman. Part of my job was to hook up the trains and check look out the windows, check for hot wheels, and drop off boxcars at different elevators. What I used to do when I used to have to go open the switch in town there when we were coming home, I'd jump the boxcars. I'd climb up the top of the boxcars, go across that bridge and wave at all the kids down below the swimming pool. Then I'd run and get your switch before the engine stopped because it was tonnage and it had an awful time to get started again. That's why I had to run to get the switch open.
By the end of January 1909, over 50 places were open for business. The town's first fire in March 1910 destroyed many buildings on Saskatchewan Avenue. Soon, fire protection was put in place. Electricity and telephones were set up. 500 maple trees and 500 poplar trees were planted. Other changes began happening too, like a park and sidewalks.
The pool was built in remembrance of the First World War, which was 1914 to 1918. So that's when the park was there at that time. In 1935, my mother and dad and my brother and my sister and I went to Vancouver, but we had to go across on a ferry across the river. And shortly after, we built that red bridge that we used for many years. That old traffic bridge was pretty narrow. It's going to take a load of grain over to Rosetown to get the wheat cleaned. I figured if I'm going to make it up the other side, I'd have to just go ahead and go fast down that road to the bridge. And I was coming down there, and here the truck started to waver like this, and I must have been going 100 miles an hour. I got up the other side all right, but I just about had a crash right on that bridge because it was so narrow. And if you meet anybody on that bridge, there wasn't very much room for a 3-ton truck to get past it. It was very scary.
It was pretty scary for 2 vehicles to go across at the same time. A lot of people lost their mirrors because it's pretty close, it's too narrow.
I remember when a big truck ran into the traffic bridge, the old one, and it was closed, so you couldn't drive to Outlook, so you had to drive to the west side of the big bridge. And so we'd go there and we'd get a ride on the jigger over to Outlook, across the bridge, and then we'd go to the station. Then when we wanted to come back, we'd catch the jigger to come back. It would hold about 6 or 8 people.
My kids were down the river there one day and they went fishing. My son came running back to me and says, "You know, Dad, there's a hole in the middle of the bridge. And here at the end of the bridge was a hole about this big, and the traffic were going by. Some of them would dodge that. And I finally parked my truck there, left the truck there so nobody would run into that hole. Sometimes in the wintertime, the cops would come to my door and they'd want me to push the bales off the bridge. They hit the top of the bridge. One long bale was stuck up on top there. I had to go back, get a fork, and put the end of my front end loader, knock that off of there.
The old traffic bridge is going to be a new walking bridge. We want to make a path on the other side of the river that connects the train bridge to the car bridge so that there'll be a loop through the park. Then we want to see if we can have a marathon or something where we use the bridges as the running track.